In the many years since Home Alone's release in 1990, it's become evident that while Kevin McCallister's solo Yuletide adventures are still tremendously fun to watch, there are a lot of things about this film that are a little too bizarre, illogical, or even downright disturbing. If you're a kid watching Home Alone, Kevin's dialogue feels almost aspirational. The things he says to his parents and other family members are the kinds of things we all wished we could say when we were young, but probably never had the nerve to do so. When his mom tells him to leave her room, for example, he responds,
"Hang up the phone and make me, why don't you?"
And then when she tells him to go upstairs after he shoves his brother Buzz in the kitchen, he shouts back,
"Upstairs."
"I am upstairs, dummy."
Granted, Kevin is in the midst of being punished when he says this, but still, calling your mom a dummy and suffering zero consequences would have felt like a dream for young moviegoers. However, as an adult, it's a little hard to overlook just how rude Kevin is and how his parents either ignore it or laugh it off. To be fair, most of the other McCallister kids are just as bad, if not worse. So Kevin really doesn't stand out that much in comparison, making the idea of traveling to Paris with so many disrespectful kids sound more like a nightmare than a vacation. Still, considering that Kevin is the protagonist, it's a little weird that he's characterized as being just as unpleasant to be around as the rest of the kids in his family. Even if you put aside the fact that the McCallisters have clearly spent a small fortune decorating every inch of their expensive home for a holiday they're not even going to be home for, have you ever taken a close look at the rest of that house? It's not just the seasonal decorations that make it feel festive. The entire interior design scheme seems to have been planned around the holiday. Just consider the green kitchen counters and red pots and pans, or the red, green, and white patterned wallpaper covering the walls of nearly every room and hallway. And there's also the parents' red bedspread, the framed red flowers on their walls, and the red and green furniture in the living room. The kitchen floor is red, the dining room walls are red, the upstairs walls are green, the living room has a red and white rug on the floor and green curtains framing the windows. Even the telephone is green. From lampshades to bathrobes to prominently placed teapots, it's hard to find a single surface or person in the McCallister house that isn't decked out for the holidays all the time. After living in such a festive home year-round, it's no wonder the McCallister children seem to be fresh out of Christmas cheer by the time December arrives. When Kevin shoves Buzz for saying he ate Kevin's entire cheese pizza, Buzz falls into some cups of milk, which spill all over the passports and airline tickets on the kitchen counter. The next morning, during the hubbub to get everyone out of the house and to the airport on time, Kevin's dad Peter mentions that the passports are in the microwave, where he put them in order to dry them off. This microwave plan was probably a bad idea for several reasons. Although passports in 1990 wouldn't have had the radio frequency identification chips contained in modern passports, which would have caused them to burst into flames in the microwave, they still would have had plastic covers, which would have melted. The passports also would have contained small amounts of metal and the foil stamping on their covers and the inner security features, which would have caused them to catch fire. Peter's lucky he didn't cause the whole trip to go up in flames. Although at least in that case, Kevin wouldn't have accidentally been left at home by himself. Kevin's mom, Kate, realizes on the plane that she left Kevin behind, and the first thing she does after landing is wrestle a payphone away from a French woman so she can call the police. What follows is a frustrating series of conversations as Kate gets transferred from one department to another and conveys her story over and over to bored officers who seem more interested in preparing for Christmas than in ensuring a child's safety. If you're a kid watching this scene, it's easy to get annoyed at the police, especially at the officer who later goes to the McCallister house, knocks once, and gives up and leaves when no one answers the door. Surely this police department is the height of professional incompetence, right? As it turns out though, maybe not. When Kate calls, all she says each time is,
Yeah, hi, look, I'm calling from Paris. I have a son who's home alone.
Our phones there are out of order, so I'd like somebody to go over to our house, tell him that we're coming home to get him.
She never mentions Kevin's age or the fact that he's not supposed to be alone. Instead, she comes across as an overprotective parent who purposely left her teenager at home and now wants the police to make sure he isn't throwing a rager while she's away. No wonder the police didn't bother investigating further when Kevin didn't answer the door. It can seem illogical that Kevin never calls the police until the end of the movie, choosing instead to construct an elaborate series of booby traps to protect himself. But by Kevin's logic, it actually makes sense. He thinks he made his family disappear by magic, and when he later encounters the wet bandits, he recognizes Harry as the police officer who visited his house earlier. Police can't help with a magically disappearing family, and they may in fact be the bad guys if Harry is one of them. But it's less clear why the pizza guy doesn't call 911 after he delivers a pie to the McCallister home and Kevin uses the Angels with Filthy Souls video to trick him into believing someone is trying to kill him. The ruse clearly works, but then nothing happens. If he's under the impression that one of his customers just tried to kill him, you'd think he'd call the police, or at least report it to his manager, who could pass the incident along to the authorities. But it appears that instead he just keeps it to himself and goes about the rest of his day. During the break-in extravaganza at the end of the film, Kevin knows to be ready because the wet bandits inadvertently tell him to expect them at 9 o'clock. But when he sets up his elaborate fake party, all he knows is that two creepy guys in a van were hanging around outside his house earlier in the day. He had no way of knowing what time they'd be coming back, or if they were even planning on returning at all. Yet somehow he managed to be enthusiastically dancing at the precise moment when Harry and Marv drove by that night. Either Kevin was incredibly lucky with his timing, or he'd already been partying for hours with his cardboard friends by the time the wet bandits finally returned. The most plausible explanation is that he had the whole party set up ready to go as soon as their van turned onto a street, kept a close watch, and it was a lot less complicated than it appeared for him to put all the cutouts in motion. But it's more fun to imagine that he was just rocking out with his inanimate guests all day. Although the church scene between Kevin and Old Man Marley is heartwarming, it's hard not to notice that it's also a little odd while watching it as an adult. Even if you put aside the fact that Kevin is in a church an hour before the wet bandits are due to arrive and he has to run home in order to make his battle plan work in time, there are still a few elements about the scene that are kinda strange when you examine them closely. It makes sense that Old Man Marley would come over to introduce himself to Kevin and tell him that he doesn't need to be afraid of him. After all, it would have been hard for him to miss his young neighbor fleeing from him in terror earlier in the movie. However, it's a little bizarre that Marley then proceeds to unload all of his troubles with his estranged son onto a second grader he's only just met and whose parents are nowhere in sight. Of course, we understand that Marley means well, especially when it comes to Kevin's rescue at the end of the film, but typically adults don't have impromptu heart-to-hearts with unaccompanied minors they don't know. Of the many traps Kevin sets for the wet bandits, one that could have proved disastrous is the electric charcoal starter that he hangs from the front doorknob. The idea behind it is simple, even if the physics are a little advanced for a second grader. Kevin plugs in the starter inside the house, hangs it on the indoor metal knob, which conducts the heat to the outdoor knob and ultimately sears an impression of itself onto an unsuspecting Harry's hand. After Harry gives up on the front entrance, Kevin leaves the starter plugged in and hanging on the door. Keeping in mind that it had already been on the door for about an hour before Harry showed up, that starter was probably left unattended for at least a couple of hours before Kevin turned it off. In that time, there would have been a serious risk of the door and subsequently the entire house catching fire.
It's pretty cool that you didn't burn the place down.
The traps that Kevin sets for the wet bandits at the end of the movie all seem like delightfully funny pranks when you're a kid. But as an adult, it's easy to see the many ways it could have resulted in death. Both criminals take some serious blows to their heads and the rest of their bodies during the home invasion sequence, any one of which could have proved lethal. First, there's the iron dropped on Marv's face via the laundry chute, which falls 3 stories to hit him squarely in the forehead. That's enough for severe facial trauma and bone fractures. Then there are the paint cans both bandits take to the face, which could have taken their heads right off. And let's not forget the crowbar that Marv used to whack Harry in the chest, which could have broken his ribs, punctured his lungs, or pierced his heart. And that's not even taking into account all the other injuries both men likely suffered as a result of Kevin's less lethal traps. Somehow, we doubt that the McCallisters' VCRs and jewelry were worth all of that.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
While it's understandable why the police don't seem to take Kevin's plight too seriously earlier in the movie, it's a little less easy to follow their process at the end. After receiving Kevin's call that the Murphys' house is being robbed, the police arrive to discover Harry and Marv significantly worse for wear, presumably still being watched over by Old Man Marley and his shovel. Harry and Marv are arrested, and Kevin watches from the window of his house, where he then goes to bed and peacefully awaits Christmas morning. Why don't the police ever question Kevin? They must have wondered why the wet bandits were so beaten up and in such a weird way, what with the feathers and burn wounds on Harry and the iron-shaped impression on Marv's face. Even if Marley attempted to take responsibility for it, the bandits were fully conscious when the police showed up, and they would likely have been grumbling about the kid that did this to them. It's bizarre that no one ever comes to get Kevin's side of the story and in the process realize that he's home by himself. If the police were better at their jobs, Kevin's mom probably would have arrived home to an empty house and the message that her son was at the police station. Sure, it would have taken away from the moving family reunion at the end, but it would have helped with everyone's peace of mind. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite films are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.